Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Margaret Cavendish and her poem Of the Style of This Book. And in particular, we're going to be discussing some diction and in particular, what she means in her internal working definition of the word fancy. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the definition of the word fancy and Margaret Cavendish's poem Of the Style of This Book. Now that's a little bit redundant, but I'm just saying that for emphasis here. The dictionary definition, of course, is not one that is exorbitantly highbrow. After all, Webster defines the word fancy as an adjectival phrase meaning imaginative or inventive. Created by the mind with capricious undertones. We really can launch into a surface defining of what Cavendish sees as fancy by diving directly into the first 4 lines of the poem. I, language, want to dress my fancies in. The hairs uncurled, the garments loose and thin. Had they but silver lace to make them gay, they'd be more courted than in poor array. Here in the first line, we see that we have a human reference to what it means to be physically fancy in terms of one's clothing, and what Margaret Cavendish calls dress. For some of us, it would be difficult to term fancy as something other than a thing that would have something to do with something other than one's physical presence. She addresses this poem to someone who has their own working definition of the word fancy, but she goes a little further. And what the poem rules on is to ask us as readers in its prosodic contract to dig deeper and apply fancy to something other. It asks us to apply the idea to conduct and to the garments of one's language and conduct other than what it means to be simply dressed in something that's brightly colored or expensive. She's talking directly to us about fancy in terms of desire and a way and mode of speaking. I feel like I'm being a little bit repetitive here, so we'll move on to applying applying the word fancy to what it might mean to look at what the word fancy might mean in the context of something like Native American literature. Because when we look at certain covers of books, for instance, we have, there's a book by Sherman Alexie called The Business of Fancy Dancing. Now, I don't have it here, but the concept of fancy in something like fancy dancing in Native American literature is particularly interesting as relates to Margaret Cavendish's poem, because in her poem, she's talking about 2 things. She is talking about what it means to fancy something that you desire and something that you want and need in your own life, but you also need to see that just the dictionary definition of that word can vary. Now, to transition to talking a little bit more about the business of fancy dancing, I was able to find a photograph of the cover of the book, and this is simply a piece of artwork that depicts a Native American individual. We don't know the gender. We don't necessarily know the setting, but we do know that there is a context of celebration in the photo, given certain things about Native culture and values and certain dances. Bright colors are worn by individuals in terms of being a certain level of fancy to celebrate a variety of things in Native American culture. So fancy is the soul in poetry, and if not good, the poem ill must be. Be just, let fancy have the upper place, and then my verses may perchance find grace. These 4 lines that come towards the close of Cavendish's poem talk of the soul in poetry, but I would posit that her meaning of the soul in poetry is not just about the soul of poetry itself. It's about the soul of art, it's about the soul of performance, and it's about the soul of human communication in general. And another relative force in terms of comparing Cavendish's definition of the word fancy to a Native American interpretation of the word fancy comes in an article by Ann Axtman called The Performative Power in Native America, Powwow Dancing. She talks in the article about her father not her father, but in her article, there is a Cherokee by the name of Calvin Burns who talks about his father being a fancy dancer. Now, this is meant to further strengthen my meaning in expressing that fancy applies to a certain extent in the culture and time and understanding of the word fancy in terms of the diction of Cavendish, but it also applies to a Native American diction, because fancy dancing, in terms of the soul of Native Americans and Cherokee and literally every Plains Native American who attends powwows, they hear the term fancy in terms of the fancy dancing. And what fancy dancing is it's a celebratory dance for Plains and Western natives. And it's practiced all over the Americas, and in some sense, to some extent, Central America as well. And the definition of it is loose, but it's just a dance that's done to celebrate and perpetuate the idea that individuality and expression through the exterior gives us clues to what happens on the interior of one's heart and soul. And in conclusion, I think really that is at the heart of what Cavendish was trying to impart to us in Of the Style of this book. And this photo relates back to Cavendish in that in the next few lines of the poem, following the first 4 that we talked about in the beginning of this presentation, we can reference the lines 5 through 10. Or had they art would make a better show, but they are plain, yet cleanly do they go. The world in bravery doth take delight, and glistering shows do more attract the sight. For everyone doth honor a rich hood, as if the outside made the inside good. Every single line of this seems to apply to a photograph like that on the cover of Alexi's book. We have in the photograph a depiction of something highly artistic and crafted. We have someone putting on a show. We have someone who, in the face of Native American culture and values in the 21st century, acting brave. Now, this photo was probably taken in the 20th century, but still, it's a time far after the decimation of that particular culture. And Sherman Alexie's culture in particular, he is Coeur d'Alene, Spokane native. And further, if we look at the lines The world and bravery doth take delight, and glistering shows do more attract the sight. These are just so relative to the image presented in the Alexi cover, because we talk about in the lines succeeding the lines about the world and bravery. We have, for everyone doth honor a rich hood, the hood in this case being the headdress depicted in the cover of the Business of Fancy Dancing. And everyone doth bow and give the place, not to the person, but the silver lace. The silver lace here is particularly important because it's a reference to clothing, to things that have a certain material value that we place on them as human beings. So again, through the whole first half of Cavendish's poem, we have language that points us in the direction of taking the word fancy as a double, if not a triple entendre, to mean a descriptor that says something is beautiful and aesthetic, to mean desire, to in a verbal sense want something, and to mean something more philosophical in terms of our language and our style, as in her style of this book. Because when we look at that word fancy, perhaps even more in Cavendish's time, we were talking about something that wasn't a word that could easily be taken for a triple entendre, because with the evolution of language throughout time, it becomes easier to spot how some words can have double, triple, quadruple meanings. And I'm sure if we took even more time to unfold the meaning of this word in Cavendish's collected works outside of this poem, we could find even more meanings for the word. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Lanning.